Verstappen is a four-time Formula One world champion. Max Verstappen is the champion of 2024. He now has the title in his grasp once again.
Well, there you have it. Max Verstappen is once again World Drivers' Champion, 4 times in a row now. A pretty rare feat unless your team is Red Bull. And I think it's always worth taking a look, not just at a driver's superb performances behind the wheel, but also take a look at the car they used to win the World Championship. And for Max Verstappen this year, it was the Adrian Newey penned Red Bull RB20. And I think it's worth taking a closer look at what is essentially Adrian Newey's final design for the Red Bull team. The English designer departing the Red Bull organisation in the first half of the season. But the RB20 that Max started the season with is essentially an Adrian Newey creation. And when we take a look at that design, it has some real Adrian Newey hallmarks, but it also has some distinctive hallmarks from other teams as well. And I think the most obvious example of that is when you look at the rear engine cover design. It may look a little bit familiar, and that's because it was a direct copy of the design that Mercedes used in 2023 that proved to be a little bit of a disaster for the German-owned British-based team. And that's a real surprise to see that Red Bull decided that actually that was a good thing to copy. But Red Bull took the concept a whole lot further than Mercedes did. And the RB20 became a really, really beautifully intricate piece of design. As we take a look at the car coming through the corner, you can really see that shape that's been copied from Mercedes and how aggressive those sort of bulges either side of the engine cover really are. But for me, the really interesting section isn't just these shoulder coolers. Well, I don't think we can call them shoulder coolers. The little cooling inlets either side of the driver's head. Now, that was a big revelation in testing. It took us a while to see what was going on there because Red Bull had kept that completely hidden during the car's launch. But in even its first shakedown run, they kept them covered up so we couldn't see. But after a little while, we noticed that, yes, the cooling slots are beside the driver's head. And the reason that Red Bull had gone for such a radical idea in terms of cooling is that they changed their sidepod concept completely. And you had this now very distinctive, and ever since widely copied, protruding upper edge of the sidepod, something that is a real departure from what Red Bull had done previously with that protruding lower edge that so many teams had copied even at the start of the 2023 season. But underneath this protruding upper edge was a really tiny little slit to feed the cooling system in the sidepod, as well as a very small vertical slit, which looked like it had come a little bit out of Ferrari's playbook from last season as well. These design features were something that proved to be hugely inspirational for the rest of the grid. And you can see it really clearly here in this bit of footage as the cars come to a stop. You can see this whole area of the car. That's the part that I think really defines the 2024 Grand Prix car, because that's the layout that almost every team at the front of the field has tried to copy, some with greater success than others. But as we move down through the design features of the car, I think it's worth taking a look at the Honda power unit itself, because the Red Bull RB20, of course, is powered by Honda. Now, Honda have clearly designed a really competent power unit this year, one of the best in the field. However, it is at times a little bit fragile. It doesn't have the longevity to be able to go all the way through the season without the drivers picking up a power unit grid penalty. Max Verstappen getting a 10-place penalty in Brazil for taking a new V6, and Sergio Perez taking some penalties earlier in the season. Not unique in the field. Every single manufacturer in Formula One has picked up at least some power unit penalties, but Honda perhaps not as strong in terms of reliability as some of their competition, but certainly very strong in terms of performance. But keeping that Honda cool is something that Red Bull has put a lot of focus on. And when we got to Bahrain for pre-season testing, we could see that rear bodywork very clearly for the first time, and they've got these huge cooling outlets either side of those big Mercedes-inspired swooping upper bodywork sections. Mercedes call it the Great Wall, as I mentioned. But this design is something that Red Bull, very early on in the car's design, had decided to play around with. And this is something we never really saw from Mercedes when they used this concept. And as we even got through the initial stages of the Bahrain race weekend, you saw that Red Bull had already closed up some of the cooling louvres at the leading edge of these slots and just left this huge cooling outlet almost reminiscent of those big upper exhaust exits you saw on the cars of about 2001 to 2003, but this is nothing of that sort. And you can see that design a little bit more clearly here, where you can see how it sits in context with the rest of the rear of the car. The reason I'm paying so much attention to this is not only did Red Bull copy a failed Mercedes design, they also took it to the next stage, and that cooling layout is something that we are going to revisit shortly. But before we get to that, I want to take a just quick look at this nice bit of footage, because we don't normally get to see this element of the car, the front brake system of the Red Bull. This again is in Bahrain, the mechanics working very much on the front end of this car. And this did highlight another slight weakness with the car's performance later in the season. As the team reached the Australian Grand Prix in Melbourne, this moment, which was very strange, happened to Max Verstappen, ruining my fantasy F1 team results, but also putting him out of the race and probably delaying his World Championship win by at least one race weekend. The Dutch driver coming into the pits after realising he'd got a brake fire at the rear end of the car, and the brake system just exploded with the heat going through that right rear corner. You can see it so clearly here, one of the most spectacular moments of the 2024 season. And you can see the state of that rear brake after that explosion here in this footage taken in the pit lane. The caliper was destroyed. You can actually see the exposed brake disc there, all of the surrounding bodywork and those cake tins absolutely trashed. That was a big moment for Red Bull and a big setback for the team. Keeping underbody components cool is actually a big factor with this Red Bull design, and I think the most interesting element of it actually. And Red Bull has been playing around all season with these cooling exits around the rear suspension mounting points, and this little one you see here just above the trailing edge of the floor. As the season progresses, we can see a little bit more development on that. But I want to move forward to another area of the car that Red Bull has been playing around with quite a lot. And of course it's this, the wing mirrors. And they introduced this bridge section quite early on in the season, and you can see it here where they've got this additional element in the middle of the wing support. Now, this isn't anything to do with keeping the mirror from flapping around. This is all to do with aerodynamic performance. The team are using, and as many teams are, the team are using the mirror supports to guide the airflow over the top of the bodywork. And you can see one of the reasons why, because Red Bull introduced these additional coolers just downstream of them, in addition to the coolers alongside the driver's head. So you've got these cooling apertures on the side of the car as well. And as we start to looking at the cooling development of the car, they've mucked around with the entry slit size here for the, what some people call the underbite cooling layout, and then also the vertical slit has been modified a few times. They've got the bungs in there, which makes it a little bit hard to see, but they have changed that through the season. But the other thing they've changed quite significantly are these cooling apertures around the driver's head. So we've got these additional coolers down here, down by the rocket logo, and then these additional coolers they've had since the start of the season alongside the driver's head. But something that you haven't really looked at enough is, of course, where the heat comes in, it has to come out. And here in Monaco, you can see in the high downforce configuration, these cooling exits along the side of the bodywork, in addition to the cooling exits on the top of the bodywork and the cooling exits down here. And the reason there's so many cooling exits is there's so many cooling entry points, and these have been changed quite significantly as the season progressed. And this is the alternate version of the cooling entry. Now you can see on this design, those shoulder coolers, as some people call them, or beside the driver's head coolers, they're being blanked off on this latter season version of the cooling layout, but they've been replaced by these cooling apertures behind the driver's helmet and underneath the main roll hoop duct. And that's quite a significant change. Now, it may look like there's not much going on, but underneath the bodywork, the team has to rearrange all of the cooling ducting, all of the routing, and in some situations, they actually have to change the cooler positioning as well. That's a big job. But when you start to see some of the other work that Red Bull have done, now have a look here. This is a different version of the cooling exits on that Great Wall early season bodywork, blanking off the rear section, but keeping that forward section open. They need to stop worrying about that though, because this is what came along later. It looked like the whole rear end of the car had melted. Long gone was the Great Wall section. Max Verstappen had this bodywork layout at the Hungarian Grand Prix. New cooling apertures around the rear, a much bigger rear cooling exit, but then much tighter bodywork down this section. Really, really interesting layout. You've got the big cooling louvres here. Then, of course, you can see those side coolers behind the driver's helmet very clearly in this shot, But these shoulder coolers, and I think we should call these ones shoulder coolers, they're still present. But when you look at this layout from the rear, you can see just how different that design is to the one that they started the season with. Because when we take a look back at the early season version, it couldn't be more different, could it? It's like a different car. We spoke to the team about it, asking them what they've changed underneath the bodywork, and the team were really cagey about that. They said they pre-planned this layout change and this higher downforce package and this revised package. Actually, I think it really isn't fair to call it a high downforce package because all of the late season races, well, we didn't see this great wall bodywork on the Red Bull at all after Adrian Newey departed the team. Coincidence perhaps, but Red Bull, like Mercedes, abandoned these drag-reducing big shoulders on the engine cover and went back to what might be considered a slightly more conventional layout. You still have the Ferrari-inspired sculpted upper section of the bodywork. That's something that Ferrari introduced in 2022 and pretty much everybody on the field has since copied. But then you've also got this quite different shape of the cooling outlets on the side of the bodywork, and that to me harks back to almost the early 2000s and some of those Renault designs with those big gills on the back of the bodywork. And I think that's an interesting design feature. But not the only one, because as we move on, we can take a look at the mirror design later in the season. Remember that design we saw early on? Well, they've changed it again with this new bodywork package. And have a look here. The connection between the main mirror housing here, which is defined by the regulations, the actual shape of it, rather than having the drag-reducing shapes above and below, which became a fashion for a while in Formula One, Red Bull had actually opted for quite an interesting and quite a simple little linkage, but you can see it clearly plays still an aerodynamic role. Is it drag-reducing, or is it moving the flow around above the bodywork the way the team want to do? You can ask them the question, they're not going to give you the answer. Interesting to see here as well, you can see the angle of that support. You can see it's playing an aerodynamic role quite clearly. But the development of the car didn't stop there. We haven't really talked enough about the rear wings. At the Belgian Grand Prix and the Italian Grand Prix, Red Bull trialled this very cut-out rear wing, and it's an interesting design, but I'm not entirely sure it had huge success. We heard some pretty unpleasant comments about its fitment at the Las Vegas Grand Prix from Max Verstappen. Didn't seem to bother him after he won the World Championship though. So perhaps that's not the most effective wing that Red Bull have run, but due to the cost cap, due to other factors, they have to take an existing wing and cut it down. That's why the sponsors' logos perhaps don't fit properly, and they've been mucking about with that cut quite significantly. And there are some other little details around the rear wing that Red Bull have used that other teams have taken inspiration from. But the shape of the nose even, that's something Red Bull changed early in the season. Now, take a look at the nose shape here. It's kind of rounded, kind of snub-nosed with that little driver cooling duct in the middle. Again, a little bit of inspiration from the 2022 Ferrari, perhaps. But if we take a look right back to the beginning of the season, you can see in the garage here, the nose of the Red Bull is much bluffer. It's much more of a flatter shape. You can see that very clearly. It doesn't have that point. It's not as smooth. It's much more squared off in this version of the bodywork than in the late season. So Red Bull, one of those teams finding a little bit of an advantage by tightening up the nose and making it a bit more pointed. Here we see at the Qatar Grand Prix, the latest iteration of that Red Bull nose shape, and it's pretty distinctively different, isn't it? But as we move through the bodywork, we can see that shape. This is the late season Red Bull in Sergio Perez trim, I think we ended up having to call it. There's the last iterations of that great wall bodywork and wasn't hugely successful. And that is perhaps one of the weaknesses of this Red Bull RB20. Sergio Perez did struggle to drive it for a lot of the season. And later in the season, when Max Verstappen started to struggle, we did hear some comments from the Mexican driver saying, Max is now really experiencing what I've struggled with all year. But Sergio Perez never really got the best out of this car, but that's because I think the car was designed around Max Verstappen, but also Max Verstappen was able to deal with the car's perhaps ill performance, if you want to call it that, or nasty little characteristics or tendencies that made that car struggle, particularly as teams like McLaren and Ferrari started to push Red Bull a little bit harder, and as Red Bull's attention perhaps shifted a little bit more to 2025 and 2026. Their rivals are catching up, and Red Bull has to do a little bit more, made the car a little bit more marginal. So towards the end of the season, we saw a variation of that Hungarian Grand Prix bodywork, very similar to what we saw in Mexico, very similar to what we saw introduced in Hungary, but refined and starting to work Both drivers used it. And again, Perez just couldn't get the results out of the car in the way Verstappen could. And even Verstappen was not looking as dominant as he had done at the start of the season. Well, with Adrian Newey having departed the team, Red Bull are entering a new era of the team's technical development. They need to find a new way of working, new technical directions. Will they develop for next year a iteration of this RB20, or will they take a new concept just for 1 year before the new 2026 regulations come in? It's a bit of a challenge, a bit of a toss-up for Red Bull, as it is for every team. Do you trade off competitiveness in 2025 to ensure that you have a car that's really quick out of the box in 2026, or do you go all out for next year, and that will come at the expense of the early part of the 2026 era and those new regulations? I suspect Red Bull are going to put their eggs in the 2026 basket, but we'll have to wait and see. It's a new era for the team, and I think Max Verstappen will be facing a much tougher challenge in the RB21 than he did at the start of 2024 in the RB20.